Hi everyone, I'm going to talk a little about income inequality in Canada. I'm going to talk about wage growth. I'm going to talk about job prospects. I'll talk about the middle class in general. I'll talk about private sector versus public sector. And I'll talk about the issues that are going to drive everything. I'm going to give you a key quote here. And this is something that's tentatively always kind of ignored by mainstream media. Canada's median income growth is grown by about 20% 2000. Everybody will say, well, it's not very good. However, if you look at factors in certain pressures on business between 2008 2009 when we had the recession, or 2001 late where we had the issues with the economy as well. In general, we're not going to see huge periods of growth with wages because of the cost competitive pressure of business. So you're going to see a little bit of less growth, but it's still growing, but slowly. This gives you a good chart to understand that wages have been growing since August 2014. It shows you by sector where you're seeing growth. Okay. Now, bear in mind here, there's been some changes on how reporting is. They're now grouping retail trade all into wholesale trades, so that number now has kind of been skewed between the retail and the wholesale trade. And in general, with the retail trade, typically they pay a lot of minimum wage, and they also typically hire students. This shows you income wage groups. This is another area that shows you in terms of the average income. If you look at the 15 to 24, that's typically where you're getting into the students age group, and they typically is where you're seeing the minimum wage being paid, and that's where you're seeing that come into play. Now let's talk about job growth. We're at a stage in an economy where we've got different sectors growing different ways. The problem is in these certain sectors like manufacturing, we're looking at specific skill sets required there. So we're not necessarily looking for university degree people with English Lit or history degrees. We're looking for people with a skilled trade, whether that's a millwright, whether that's a welder, whether that's an industrial electrician. That's what we're looking for here in durable manufacturing. Transportation, public utility is a specific skill set required there as well. Financial, insurance, and real estate, this is where you're seeing where your degrees can come into play. This is where you're seeing some growth. Wholesale and retail trade, you're seeing some combination where business marketing degrees where people could get into them, but you're seeing that those particular trades are paying a little less. But that wholesale retail trade is kind of skewed because it reflects the retail side as well, which typically hires students. Let's talk about median income growth. Canada actually has been growing. It's not a lot in percentage, but it's been growing. And you have to look at different eras since 1981. We had a recession in the early 90s. We had a downturn a bit in 2001. We had 2008 to 2009 recession. But what I want you to take away on this quickly is median income growth also talks about redistribution of wealth. Canada does a pretty good job of taking that income bucket and redistributing it back to healthcare and education. Now, if the provincial governments don't manage the dollars properly, then you're also seeing where you're seeing a cut down in services. So you have to look at the whole gamut when you're looking at this discussion. I want to talk about tax cuts. There's a lot of rhetoric going around that, but in essence, the low income tax people brackets have basically seen their after-tax income grow by 4% based on the tax cut the Conservative government brought into play. Let's talk about private sector versus public sector wages. In general, a public sector person makes about $8,000 more a year. Now remember what this is. The public sector exists to support social services from when you're getting into municipal level, from firefighting to police work. You get into provincial government, that's education and healthcare, and you get into federal government like the Department of Veterans Affairs. These guys are all paid a pretty good penny. That also costs taxpayers dollars. So that's one issue. The other issue is government doesn't operate in a competitive marketplace. And you're probably asking what that means. They're not acting where they're going to the free markets where market prices are dictating. They control what it is because they're captive. Because they're responsible for providing those services. They're not outsourcing police or firefighting to a private sector. They're actually keeping that in-house. Therefore, they're paying that cost. There's no pressure on them to keep control of costs other than their fiscal restraints they're doing. So it needs to be going forward. Government has to look at arbitration, pension reform, and salary reforms to kind of better align that to what happens in the private sector. Government jobs. You cannot grow government jobs greater than the private sector. You have to be more prudent and efficient way of delivering service. You're going to hear the concept of value for money. This comes into play. You need to be more prudent how you deliver money by looking at technology and looking better ways to get value for money. Let's talk about the issues facing hiring. Well, I'll break it into multiple issues, and we'll talk about macro and micro indicators here. First of all, you've got things that are going to drive exports. That's your trade agreements and FIPA. You're going to have things that drive local spending or investment by companies, and that's government policies from hydro rates to pensions to carbon taxing. Now, all those have an impact when you got taxation or cost increases on consumer spending. They'll add cost to consumer spending, which then forces people to have less money to spend on other things. 2/3 of the economy is driven by consumer spending. So it's very critical to understand that the more cost you add to government that's passed on to the consumer, the less money there is. And that's going to impact GDP. That's never really discussed by any of the governments. They'll play a mask screen around that, but it's very critical to understand that driver. So what I try to do here is understand things. If business is under pressure to compete, they're going to look at ways to reduce their costs. Either hold wages down, maybe cut them back, or they may reduce hours. Reducing hours and reducing wages down and freezing them doesn't help the economy. So you have to ask yourself, when you're looking at government policies and talking about it, you need to make sure that these governments understand the key indicators that drive job creation. And throwing money in at more taxation policies doesn't drive it. And that's the key aspect that I wanted you to get out of this presentation. Thank you.